Lesson 46 useReducer. 1. Introduction. Hello everyone. Today we are going to look at a powerful state management tool inside React, the hook called useReducer. Many of you are already familiar with simple state using a setter function. useReducer gives us an alternative approach, one that can scale better when state logic becomes more complex. It helps you centralize your update logic in one place, leading to cleaner components and easier maintenance. 2. What is useReducer and when to use it? The useReducer hook lets you plug a reducer into your component. A reducer is simply a function that takes the current state and an action, and returns a new state. When your component's state changes according to different kinds of actions, useReducer can be a more expressive tool than managing many independent state variables. You might choose useReducer when you have multiple related state values that change together. The update logic is non-trivial, for example, updating nested objects or arrays. You want to isolate the logic for state transitions outside of the event handlers, keeping handlers simpler. In short, it's option B when your state logic has grown beyond simple toggles or independent setters. 3. How it works. When you apply useReducer in a component you provide, first, the reducer function that defines how to update the state given an action. Second, an initial state, or an argument from which initial state is derived, and optionally a third parameter, an initializer function that computes the initial state lazily. The hook returns exactly two things, the current state and a dispatch function. You use dispatch to send an action. The reducer receives that action and produces the next state. React then re-renders the component with the updated state. It's important to note, the dispatch function has a stable identity, and state updates are asynchronous in the sense that they trigger a future render. You can't rely on immediately reading the updated state right after dispatch in the same execution context. 4. Writing the reducer function. The core of useReducer is the reducer function. It must be a pure function, meaning it should compute new state only from its inputs, current state and action, without side effects. It should not mutate the existing state directly. Instead, it returns a fresh new state object, or array, whenever something changes. Actions are what your dispatch sends. Conventionally, an action is an object with a type, property plus optional additional data. Your reducer examines the action's type and selects how to compute the next state. If you ever discover that part of your state becomes undefined after a transition, or nothing changes when you expect it, check your reducer. Maybe you didn't cover a certain action case, or maybe you forgot to carry over unchanged state fields. 5. Initial state and lazy initialization. When you call useReducer, you supply the initial state, or an initial argument, and optionally an initializer function. The initializer function is useful when computing the initial state is expensive. For example, building a large data structure, you only want to pay that cost once, not on every render. If you don't supply an initializer, React simply uses the initial argument as the state on first render, and ignores it on subsequent renders. Knowing this helps avoid performance pitfalls. If your initialization logic is heavy, consider using an initializer. Also remember, React holds onto the initial state after the first render, so passing a computed value each render without initializer would waste work. 6. Common pitfalls and troubleshooting. There are several situations where things go wrong with useReducer. Recognizing these helps you debug faster. Dispatching an action but logging shows the old state. After you call dispatch, the state variable you hold in your event handler remains the old value until the next render happens. This is normal because state updates schedule a render, they do not change the variable in place. Dispatching an action but UI doesn't update. If the reducer returns a value that is strictly equal, by identity, to the previous state, React will skip the re-render. This can happen if you mutate the existing state object rather than returning a new one. Always return a new object, array when state changes. Part of state becomes undefined. Often this means you returned an object missing some fields from previous state. You forgot to include them. Ensure your return state includes all relevant fields, either by copying them forward or structuring accordingly. Too many re-renders error. Usually this means you dispatched an action during render, rather than in an event handler or effect, causing a render dispatch loop. Avoid invoking dispatch unconditionally during render. Reducer or initializer function runs twice. In development with strict mode. React in strict mode may call your reducer or initializer twice to help you detect impurities. If your reducer or initializer is impure, mutating state or relying on side effects, you may see unexpected behavior. Keeping these functions pure avoids this issue. 7. Choosing between useState and useReducer. Finally, how do you decide whether to use useState or useReducer? For simple cases, for example, a few independent value strings, toggles, counters, useState is concise and easy. When things start to grow, you have multiple related pieces of state, transitions that depend on the previous state, or you prefer centralizing update logic for clarity, then useReducer becomes an appropriate choice. The goal is readability, maintainability, and predictable update logic. 8. Summary. useReducer is a hook that helps you manage state transitions by delegating the logic to a reducer function and triggering those transitions via a dispatch mechanism. It shines when you have more complex state update logic and want a clean separation between what happened, action, and how state should change, reducer. Remember to always write your reducer and initializer as pure functions, avoid mutating state, and use initializer functions if initial state creation is expensive. With those guidelines in mind, you'll find useReducer an elegant tool in your React state management arsenal.